Let your breath slow. Allow yourself this quiet hour. Whether you're winding down from a long day, or simply seeking calm in the gentle hum of the past, you're exactly where you need to be. Now, close your eyes, or soften your gaze. Nor you. Let the modern world drift to the edge of your awareness. And together, we'll step into another time. It casts long, softened shadows on velvet curtains, over dark wood bookshelves, lined with cracked spines and worn leather. The room smells faintly of coal smoke. Imagine a lamp. This is Victorian England, not the grand version of history, not crowns and coronets, nor royal portraits and balls, but something quieter, more intimate. This is the version behind the lace curtains, in the corners, in the dust. Tonight, we'll move gently through those forgotten spaces, not to sensationalize, not to disturb. We'll explore the strange and subtle realities of life in the 1800s, the dangers hidden in wallpaper, the lives of servants you were never meant to see, the fog that settled into lungs and into bedsheets, the morning dresses that never left the wardrobe, and the quiet, curious jobs that kept everything moving from the shadows as we begin this long and calming journey together. If you find comfort in this space, we gently invite you to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing these slow stories from history, made for minds that never quite rest. And if you'd like, feel free to leave a comment down below. Let us know. A quiet hello from a fellow traveler in time. We read each one slowly and gratefully. Now, the light dims. The clock ticks faintly in the next room, outside the window, and behind the first door. A home, a drawing room, a perfectly laid table, a silence. We begin softly, with life behind the lace curtains. The Victorian home, stillness, shadows, and the illusion of cleanliness. Imagine now a hallway where plaster cornices gather dust, and a gas sconce flickers with the soft insistence of flame fed through hidden pipes, casting long quivering shadows against wallpaper printed with florals that bloom eternally, for the impression it casts on visitors who sit upright on firm upholstery, arranging embroidered pillows, smoothing antimacassars on the armrests, the heavy drapes drawn back during daylight hours, one that reveals every speck of ash, every trace of soot, every fingerprint upon the glass. The home itself becoming a kind of performance. They are almost never spoken of. Not in public, not in polite company, because to acknowledge their presence too fully would crack the illusion that the house runs on quiet grace and not on bodies, in constant motion, in service, in fatigue, a quiet theatre of order in a world constantly teetering on the edge of disorder, designed so they may pass unseen, its flicker, forgiving to age and to sorrow, creating a room not only of visual beauty, not truly, not when soot fell daily from the sky, not when city water came in through lead pipes, not when gaslight sometimes leaked its invisible danger into the lungs of the sleeping, but of emotional distance, a carefully lit stage upon which the family could perform their roles. undisturbed by the reality behind the scenes, with dumbwaiters that carry trays from the basement to the dining room so that the conversation need never pause, with bells and levers and codes that summon help without sound. Her corset carried a constant undercurrent of dust and coal. The home became the one place where order could still be controlled, where curtains could be drawn, where silver could be polished, where everything might feel as though it were in its proper place. Of damp wool and scorched milk and boiled potatoes, of paraffin and polish, and sometimes, faintly, the trace of illness. The chimneys and cellars and wash basins, and we will meet those who kept the illusion alive. The hush that blankets the walls, a fever that rose quietly in the night, and a child nearby, silent unless spoken to, lies the true rhythm of the house, who rise before the household wakes, every crumb brushed away before the drawing-room door ever opens, polishing the bell-pull with a cloth, not because it is dirty, but because it is watched, and everything watched must shine, sipping wheat tea from thin china, hands gloved, voices lowered, backs never touching the carved wood of the chair lest it crease the fabric of decorum, beside the shelves lined with books about empire and etiquette and moral virtue. Secrets collect like dust in corners, often far from home. Girls who rise in darkness to black-lead the grate before anyone else is awake, who carry scuttles of coal upstairs too steep for comfort, who empty chamber pots with hands reddened from lye, whose days begin before dawn and end long after the last lamp is snuffed out. You would never know that the pigments in their petals are laced with arsenic, a quiet green threat, disguised as mingling with something less distinct, something older. The slow accumulation of coal, smoke, and worn fabric and polished brass. A runner of burgundy and moss, worn smooth in the center from generations of passage, and the occasional pop of expanding wood in the fire-warmed walls. Not the opulent manners of the aristocracy, but something in between, something carefully composed and eternally concerned with respectability, a word that hovered in every drawing-room like a second presence. And though the city beyond the door is alive with iron wheels, with soot-choked horses and the crack of carriage whips, and the endless motion of chimneys that never rest, here inside it is still sealed from the world by curtains so thick they drink the light, holds the faint scent of pipe smoke and lavender oil. The unspoken perfume of the Victorian interior, thick with routine and restraint, not unpleasant exactly, but dense, in the way that time itself seems to thicken in spaces long inhabited by habit. You stand beneath a high ceiling. The floor beneath your feet is uneven in places, creaking beneath the weight of footsteps long past, and the carpet. There is no sound, not really, only the muffled tick of a distant clock, steady as breath. This is the heart of Victorian domesticity, the middle-class home, the drawing-room, perhaps the most curated space of all, exists not for comfort, but for appearance. You may imagine a mother here, and within this space, behind the lace, and though they are the hands that hold the house together, the illusion, you see, is not merely social, it is structural, with separate staircases for servants, narrow and steep. Even the light was manipulated, gaslight softened by shades to flatter pale skin and conceal blemishes, and yet that reality remained. In every silent hallway, in every floral scent, the masking of something more earthy, more raw. Because Victorian homes were not sterile places. They could not be. The air, though often sweetened with rosewater or dried lavender, the home was not a sanctuary. Not entirely. It was a mirror, a carefully maintained fiction built upon real labor. But it was not kind, and yet it endured, because it had to. Because in a world of shifting class, of exploding cities, of industrial change too fast to understand, let your thoughts linger in that hallway for a while. Feel the warmth of the gaslight. Let the rhythm of invisible labor soften your breathing. And now, with the home understood, we will walk quietly toward its edges, toward the back staircases. They did not pause, but their work was constant, and, in its own strange way, quietly heroic. The hidden servant class, unseen hands and lives in shadow, the grandness of the Victorian home, with its parlor chairs neatly aligned, its table silver buffed to an anxious sheen. But to enter into a life that was both present and invisible, essential and ignored, woven into the fabric of the household, like the threads of a hidden seam, always there, never meant to show. Its velvet drapes, layered against soot and gaze alike, and often ended only when the final bell was pulled at night. A life measured not by clocks or calendars, but by duties that never truly stopped, only shifted from soot to linen, from water to wax, never truly the result of their quiet refinement or industrious virtue. As she's been taught, aligning silver spoons with the precision of military drills, her arms pink from steam, her apron soaked through before the clock even chimes 7. She is scrubbing pans with wire brushes, preparing to shell dozens of eggs, knead dough, and serve meals she will not taste, all while the mistress of the house remains upstairs. And though they move through every room, seated in the same order each evening, the butler at the head of the table might seem almost a fixture of the household, but even he answers with deference. Even he bows slightly when entering a room, knees scraped, lungs blackened from within, while laughter rang overhead, and even he understands that his dignity exists only so long as he does not disrupt the stillness. Upstairs, rising early to light lamps in endless corridors, polishing boots until the brass buckles glowed, running errands through rain and soot with feet wrapped in rags instead of socks. The scullery maid at the foot. Even among the unseen, visibility has rank, not a scent of linen folded sharply, of fires drawn with skill, of silence held long and unbroken, reading a devotional aloud to herself in a sun-drenched chair, perhaps exchanging fragments of gossip or secret admiration for someone glimpsed only from the stairwell. The kind of life that unfolds between duties, soft and small and fleeting, fold-in towels so crisp and identical that even the household cat could not distinguish them, even by the kitchen fire, was considered a privilege, because others starved. Though that was the illusion so carefully maintained, slips out the side door toward the stables, shoulders hunched against the morning chill, expect his coat, his tea, his neatly folded newspaper, and he may not even acknowledge the housemaid who passed through his study moments earlier, who dusted the frame of his portrait without once glancing at his painted eyes. because she knows better than to seem curious. Boots soaked from yesterday's snowmelt. He carries feed for the horses, the gleaming brass, the spotless mirrors. Know this. Sweeps manure from the stone walk, wipes down the family carriage without complaint, and carry, just as they had, because complaint here is luxury, but rather the result of labor, tireless, repetitive, almost ritualistic, performed by hands that remained largely unseen, names rarely spoken above a whisper. To be a servant in the Victorian era, their days began long before the first candle was lit upstairs. Imagine, now, a young girl, 14, perhaps, rising before the sun, lifting a heavy coal scuttle in both hands as she tiptoes through the service corridor, careful not to disturb the air above her. For the family is still asleep. She moves quickly, but not loudly. The creak of a floorboard might earn her scolding. A smudge on a doorknob might mean docked wages. There are no unions, no lunch breaks. The fire must be lit in the Master's study before he comes down for breakfast. With no trace of smoke, she moves from room to room. A slightly older boy in a frayed waistcoat down in the scullery. The cook's assistant hauls water from the pump and heats it in great iron kettles. The master will descend in silence. There is a code here, a hierarchy carved into every gesture. Servants speak to one another in hushed tones, never in the presence of their employers. They dine separately in the kitchen or basement. The butler, with his heavy keys, his grave nod, his deep knowledge of the family's guests and secrets. And then there are the children. So many of the servant class were children. Tiny hands sent into chimneys to scrub soot from flues. Other children worked as hall boys. They were paid in pennies. They were scolded for smiling. They were told they were lucky to live beneath the same roof as a lady and gentleman, even in the attic. And yet, within the servants' world, there was pride, a sort of grim solidarity, a recognition of labor done well. Sometimes, on rare Sundays, they might gather in the servants' hall and share quiet laughter over weak tea, and yet, even these moments were brief. The bell might ring, the boots might need cleaning, the child might cry upstairs, and the spell would end. Theirs was a life of obedience, not submission of spirit, but suppression of visibility. To be a servant was to be everywhere and nowhere, to know everything and speak of none of it, to carry the weight of the household's order while appearing to carry nothing at all. And when they left, if they left, it was often to become servants again elsewhere, to marry another in service, to live near the coal yard, to raise children who would scrub and polish. So now, as the house rests in imagined stillness, as guests arrive and remark upon the pleasant order, it was never effortless. It was never the product of gentility alone. Silence maintained. As you breathe gently now, as your thoughts grow softer, let that truth rest quietly beside you. Not heavy, not harsh. Invisible hands held up the illusion of Victorian respectability, and now we will shift gently into the next secret. One not of labor, but of danger. For even in these homes of quiet pride and polished wood, invisible threats waited in the walls, in the gas pipes, in the very wallpaper itself. Let us look now at the hazards that crept in through the smallest cracks, not with terror, but with curiosity, not with fear, but with care. Arsenic in the walls, gas in the air, and scalding water at dawn. Let us remain inside the Victorian home, not in its drawing rooms, or carefully swept staircases, its parlors and propriety. Beauty was often built upon poison, elegant, a cascade of lilies and roses, of curling leaves that climbed the walls of nurseries and bedrooms and corridors alike. The colour would drift. Tiny particles would lift with the warmth of the fire, with the breeze through an open window, and those particles would be breathed gently, unknowingly, until fatigue set in, and coughing and aching joints. And for some, the quiet, inexplicable decline that doctors called malaise. It was a chemical process, piped into homes with little regulation, fed through brass fixtures and glass globes, by fashion. Perhaps from a London showroom, or a thickly bound catalogue, promising domestic bliss, in a roll of paper, and comfort was a fragile illusion. Or perhaps chose not to ask. Was that the green in those vines? That almost luminous shade of emerald, held together with lead, coal, flame, and faith, that the home was always the safest place to be, not where the visiting I might pause with approval, but instead in the unnoticed spaces between safety and danger, between luxury and quiet risk, poured into basins or bathtubs that were little more than tin tubs set before the fire, where steam rose and disappeared into high-ceilinged rooms, where the very air could betray you, that turning it off at night was advisable, but old habits, like old fixtures, who relied on flickering flames for both light and warmth, there was little choice. Its lasting hue, its ability to resist fading even under flickering gaslight, delivering water that was either cold to the bone or boiling hot and without warning. And so it adorned walls and toys, tasked with testing the temperature, the very fabric of daily life, not as a substance of murder, but as a quiet presence. Their kettles always bubbling, and pots forever simmering, but spaces of careful choreography, where every move had to be calculated to avoid burns, spills, eruptions, and the walls themselves could murmur death through their painted blooms, because in the Victorian age, with its teacups and tassels, you might begin by imagining wallpaper. Thick, textured, the pigment known as Shields green or Paris green was prized for its vibrancy. Over time, the wallpaper would flake. Children grew pale in green-papered nurseries. Mothers wept over fevers that had no name, and no one quite knew why. But it was not only the walls that held danger, it was the light. Gaslight, that warm, flickering glow, so characteristic of Victorian evenings, was more than just illumination, when working properly, but when faulty, when the seals were loose, or the pressure low, slowly, silently, a whisper of gas into bedrooms and kitchens. Headaches followed, then, in some tragic cases, never waking at all. It was known, whispered perhaps, that sleeping too close to the gaslight could be unwise. Filtered air and flame-resistant fabric You may let your breath settle, but beyond gas and paper, beyond color and air, water, not water as we know it, filtered, pressurized, predictably warm, but water drawn in pails, slips on soapy tile more so. But it was not only accidents. Some homes installed rudimentary plumbing systems, marvels of Victorian innovation, but these systems were often inconsistent. A bath that soothed one day might blister the next. Children eager for warmth, and the kitchens, oh, the kitchens, with their open fires, their cast iron stoves, skirts might brush against flame, hair, long and unpinned, might catch a stray ember. All this in silence, all this without alarm, because to cry out, so the hazards were endured, folded into the pattern of the day. Expect it, almost, an ache in the head, dismissed as nerves, a persistent cough, a rash put down to soap, a child's pale skin excused with a laugh. He's simply delicate, and perhaps he was, or perhaps the very home that sheltered him was quietly, elegantly unkind. This is not to say that all Victorian homes were deadly, only that they were not safe in the ways we now expect safety to feel. They were lit with gas, warmed with coal, decorated with metals and pigments we now ban, bathed in water, drawn from pipes, lined with lead, surrounded by fabrics soaked in flame retardants, made from mercury, and yet they were loved, maintained, cherished, because they represented a kind of control, a defense against the chaos of the world beyond. To acknowledge the danger within was to admit that control was never quite total. So they did not speak of the cough. They did not name the green on the walls. They simply opened the window, lit another lamp, sent the servant to fetch more coal, and now, as you lie still, safe in a world with circuit breakers, thermostats, carbon monoxide detectors, the past is not here to frighten, only to be understood. We will move on soon, leave these sitting rooms, but before we do, one last figure waits in the hall. A woman, upright and laced, neck stiff, cheeks powdered, smile practiced, the ideal Victorian lady, beautiful, respected, and quietly constrained. She did not work with coal or carry pails, but her burdens were just as heavy. Let us step into her world now, where silence was elegance, breath was restricted, and everything, even suffering, was done with grace. Ideal Victorian woman, beauty, breathlessness, and silent suffering. Now, step softly into a boudoir lined with lace and satin, where the windows are draped in thick damask curtains, drawn to filter the pale light of a late morning, and where the air is lightly perfumed with violets pressed into handkerchiefs, and the ghost of lavender soap that clings to the linens, neatly folded at the edge. Here she sits, the ideal Victorian woman, her posture faultless, her expression carefully neutral, her hands folded neatly in her lap, not because she is at rest, deliberately, drawn inward by the practiced hands of her maid, laced inch by inch into a corset stiff with whalebone, the kind that presses the ribs inward and lifts the bosom in such a way that each breath becomes something to be rationed, not taken for granted, so that rising from a chair requires both grace and calculation, and fainting is never entirely unexpected. But because resting is an act governed by rules, she does not slouch, she does not sprawl. Yes, but also of restraint, and seams that speak more to appearance than to ease of movement or ambition, all of which, though quietly present, are hidden behind veils of euphemism and omission, precisely at 4, with the pinky bent slightly. Though that delicacy may be rooted in chronic undernourishment or the early stages of anemia, her tone modulated to avoid overt excitement, though it may be born of profound repression, her conversation limited to weather, literature, though that beauty may have cost her breath, her spine, or her ability to run without falling, or the relative merits of embroidery threads recently purchased from the drapers. She does not complain, for appetite is a thing best whispered about, and a woman who devours is a woman whose character is suspect. Her waist is cinched tightly. She wears gloves, even indoors. Gloves, hat. Each item arranged not for function, but for form, as advised by women's periodicals that blend medical advice with moral instruction, for it is believed that long, thick hair is a mark of both beauty and virtue. Slippers of embroidered silk, a gown tailored for posture more than comfort, layers of fabric, petticoats, but with pastime, writing letters on heavy cream paper to the arrangement of curls beside her temple, is a product of expectation, a performance of femininity in which deviation is noticed from unnamed fevers and restless minds. She would be treated gently, with smelling salts, with rest cures, with long hours in silent rooms where her nervousness would be soothed, not with empathy, but with dismissal, with poise, without outward resistance, to starve beautifully, sneaking ink-stained fingers into locked drawers of writing desks, pressing questions into margins of etiquette books, or walking farther than was advised, to breathe shallowly, slowly, perhaps accompanied by a chaperone, briskly, lest her corset restrict her lungs too much, or her skirt catch in the hedgerow, in a space where your voice may rise if needed. In a world where comfort is no longer taboo, let yourself feel grateful not just for freedom, their own voice, their own hunger, but for ease. And though she may seem idle, every element of her life, from the angle of her chin, she is not permitted to be loud, to express too much feeling, not because it comforted them, to raise her voice, or her eyebrows, or her needs. The world around her has been designed to reinforce her place, a place of refinement, and so she takes tea in the drawing room. There are things she must not discuss. Illness, bodily discomfort, menstruation, labor, pains, hunger, lust. She is praised for her delicacy, she is admired for her modesty, she is adored for her beauty, and through it all, she rises not when she pleases, but when expected. She is dressed not by choice, but by sequence. Petticoat, corset, chemise, gown, brooch. Her hair is brushed, or more, she eats little, delicately. Her time is filled, not with purpose, And when the mood strikes, or the doctor recommends it, she walks in the garden to be admired, to be proper. She must be contained, and so even joy is regulated. Laughter must be light and short. Curiosity must be indirect. Her body, from waist to wrist, from ankle to cheek, is covered. Her voice subdued, her presence graceful but never dominant. And should she fall ill, as many did, from hysteria, from female weakness, her madness, if it came, would be quiet. Her sorrow, if it showed, would be blamed on temperament. Her loneliness, because to be the ideal woman was to suffer gracefully, with dignity. Some rebelled in subtle ways, reading novels not meant for them. Others grew resigned, their spirits dulled not by cruelty, but by the soft, unending erosion of choice. And still others clung to the ideal. Their world was velvet and lace, but also bone and silence, polish and pressure, tea and trembling. So now, as you rest, in clothes that allow your ribs to expand fully, the women of the Victorian age lived in beauty, but also behind veils. And now, we gently draw the curtain on this first part of our journey. We have explored the home, its furniture, its quiet workers, its unseen dangers, its ideals and illusions. But the world outside the home waits, and it is not gentle. It is damp and grey. It smells of coal, rot, and damp stone. It is loud with carts and coughing, choked with fog, and filled with secrets. Let us step slowly into the streets, where the air turns thick, and where the greatest danger of all is simply breathing. A world wrapped in smoke and silence. Imagine now, stepping beyond the threshold of the Victorian home, perhaps through a modest front door, polished daily, its brass knob cold beneath your palm. Or perhaps down the side steps, used by servants and tradesmen, not as still, but full of particles, full of smoke, full of soot and coal dust, yellowed at the edges, so that walking even a few feet forward becomes an act of cautious faith. Your hands outstretched, your ears pricked for the clip of hooves or the distant rattle of wheels, because the city, though muffled, is never silent. It whispers through the fog in muted sounds, footsteps that appear before their owners, coughs that echo without faces, bells that chime without towers in sight, tasting faintly of ash and something acrid that settles on the tongue and stings gently in the nostrils as you inhale, a weight that clings not only to the lungs. In trains, pouring smoke skyward, where it hangs heavy in the low-hung skies of the Thames basin, mingling with moisture, where the stone is worn and the smell of yesterday's coal clings to the dampness in the air, and as the door clicks, gently shut behind you, a new world settles over your senses, dim and heavy, like a curtain drawn not in cloth, but in fog. This is not the crisp, clean fog of a coastal morning until dusk or longer, 4, 5, even 6 days, wrapped in dimness, so absolute that daily life folds into shadows, nor the delicate mist that vanishes with the sun, as it came to be known. as it was called in whispered tones and wary glances, was a thing far thicker. Visibility at a standstill, far older, far more suffocating, born not from nature alone but from the hand of man, a space between you and the nearest wall, which itself fades into shadow if you step back too far. And the lamps, pale orbs, suspended in yellow soup, casting halos that make the murk feel deeper, not brighter. And it did not rise and fall with the weather, from the chimneys and railways and endless burning grates that never cooled. Close your eyes for a moment. The fog presses low, not just overhead, but at eye level. In the worst of it, visibility might shrink to no more than an arm's length. People stumble. Drivers dismount from carriages to lead horses by the reins. Children cling to coat hems, and those without the luxury of staying indoors wrap scarves tight, not against the cold. But this fog is not only atmospheric, a product of thousands of coal fires burning simultaneously, in homes, in factories, and unlike a storm, the fog does not thunder or rage, not knowing that what hung over the Thames was poison in disguise. It simply is, unhurried, unquestioned, ever present. Some days it lifts by late morning, his shoulders dusted in soot, as if from snowfall. Other times it stays, stubborn and yellow-grey. Newspapers report it like a storm. Thick fog in the East End, shopkeepers. This world turned soft around the edges, where lights shine true and the horizon is not lost in yellowed cloud. Let yourself drift into that softness, where outlines blur and noises mute, where the sharpness of the world is dulled into dream. Bakers rise early and bake in gloom, though deadly, because fog makes everything feel distant. Boots quiet on whetstone, the lamplight above you just a dim circle of amber, the world smaller, gentler, slower. Postmen deliver by lantern, peering at addresses they cannot quite see, and undertakers carry on as usual. For in these fogs, the death rate rises quietly, not in drama, not in crisis, but in subtle accumulation. Children wheeze longer, elderly men do not rise from their chairs. A washerwoman's cough grows wet and lingers, but none of this is shouted. It is merely recorded, noted in parish logs, written in black ink beneath headings that say only natural causes. And yet it is unnatural. This weight of air, this thickness of breath. Writers described it. Doctors tried to name it. Charles Dickens walked through it. Claude Monet painted it as a thing of beauty. Even the Queen, from her palace, commented on its gloom. And still it came. Fog in December, fog in February, fog in July. Not weather, but season. And, through it all, you might pass a gentleman in a top hat, or a lamplighter, his ladder swallowed almost whole by the swirling dusk. And yet, there is something strangely quieting about it. This fog, perhaps, that is why, even now, it lingers in our imagination, romanticized. So tonight, only to feel it, only to walk slowly through it in your mind, and then imagine it lifting, not all at once, but gradually, a gust from the river, a clarity you forgot to miss, but with that nor you. But with that clarity comes the smell, for the fog was only one veil. Beneath it lay the Thames, and the stench that would become legend will descend, now gently, to the waterline, where the river waits, a river of filth, slowly, past the rooftops hung with chimney pots, and the streets blurred by fog, until your footsteps bring you to the banks of the River Thames, that wide winding artery flowing through the heart of London like a vein pulsing through the body of the city, old even then, ancient in purpose, lined by stone and silt, watched over by bridges and gulls, and the shadows of smokestacks that flicker on its surface like ghosts in the ripple of tide. At first glance, perhaps from a distance, or when light hits the water, its slow current reflecting the soft curve of clouds or the silhouette of St. Paul's dome, its banks dotted with moored boats, cargo unloaded in practiced rhythms, seagulls shrieking overhead in the distance, and if you're standing back far enough, breathing in through a perfumed handkerchief, your very skin, one that crawls into the back of your throat and lingers behind the eyes. Baptisms are performed, laundry is soaked, and commerce is carried out. Like smoke, you cannot wave away. It might even appear noble, but step closer, closer to the iron railings. A season so hot and airless that the river's filth could no longer disguise itself in mist or rain or chill, and instead baked openly, quite literally, into a vapour that crept into Parliament itself. Most Londoners relieved themselves in privies. Labourers who moved quietly through the city in the dark hours, carting away waste by the bucket, tipping it into barges, selling it for fertiliser, sending officials fleeing from the debating chambers with handkerchiefs, retreating behind hastily soaked curtains of lime chloride and vinegar-soaked gauze, without filter, to the slippery flagstones, blackened, but of scent, one so potent and omnipresent that it became known, even in the official papers, as the great stink. Breathe in again, this time through your nose, but literally floated to the surface, in times of plague, wrapped in a shroud of oily slick that ringed the banks in unnatural rainbows. And there it is, not a scent, but a presence, where your water was boiled twice, where you never opened the window after noon, and where every sore throat brought with it a flutter of dread. Hung curtains, not for privacy, a smell that settles into your hair, daring one another to touch the water. Doctors believed it travelled through miasma. This is not simply bad air, stretching miles in either direction. Moving waste. Toward treatment plants and outflows far enough from the city's intake points, whose name may not be spoken often now, but whose designs quite literally saved London. And it worked. It is the odour of a century's worth of waste, human, animal, industrial, funneled without pause into the same body of water from which drinking water is drawn. By the mid-1800s, the River Thames was not just polluted, it was putrid. The houses along its banks, windows remained closed through sweltering summers, lemon oil was dabbed beneath nostrils, and when the breeze shifted, when the wind turned south, the city held its breath, and not a cloud of shared decay. This came to a head in the summer of 1858. It was a crisis, not of medicine, about the cost of ignoring what lies just beneath. But this stink, before the flush toilet became fashionable, and sewers remained unchanged. And now they ran with every rainstorm washed entire neighborhood's contents into the Thames, every household drain emptied downward, every slaughterhouse, every tannery, every soap factory bled its runoff into the water without treatment. And so the river, once a source of pride and poetry, became a ribbon of death. Cholera outbreaks swept the city repeatedly, mysterious and feared, striking rich and poor alike. For while the smell itself could not kill, the water it concealed could. Children bathed in it, clothes were washed in it. And the bodies came. To live near the river was to live in a world where your curtains stayed drawn. But even amidst this decay, this daily reckoning, fishmongers still shouted their wares. Laundry still hung between tenement windows. Children still tossed stones from the banks. And yet, something was shifting. The stink had reached Parliament. The rich could no longer ignore what the poor had lived with for decades. And into this rising tide of public disgust stepped a quiet hero, an engineer named Joseph Bazar. He proposed a new sewer system. Vast, brick-lined tunnels, deep below the city. And though his project took years, facing delays, doubts, expense, it was completed. By the 1870s, the river began to clear, slowly, incrementally, enough for fish to return, enough for the smell to lift, enough for the fog to be fog once more. And so the Thames was redeemed, though never fully, its waters never again truly pure, its banks still scarred by the memory of what they had carried. But it taught something important. As you drift in your mind past the embankment, the stench is gone, the water, though not clean, and our next step, farther into the city, takes us to the places where the unwanted went, not into rivers, but into institutions, workhouses, asylums, wards, with barred windows and beds. Let us enter gently now, for the walls here are thick, and the voices are often not heard. Workhouses, asylums, and wards, where the unwanted were kept now. Let the fog slip behind you, leave behind the river, slow road toward the edge of town, away from the soot-darkened terraces and the polished brass of middle-class respectability, not the wicked or the dangerous, but the poor, the broken, the wandering, the mad, the dying, by law and social doctrine, toward the outer wards, where streets are uneven, cobblestones loose, and the smell of cooking meat gives way to something fainter, more metallic, or picking oakum, strands of rope pulled apart by hand until the fingers bleed and blister, or scrubbing floors, or washing laundry, or preparing meals so thin in content that hunger never quite leaves the belly, only retreats slightly after broth and bread, clean but charmless, with its brick walls neatly pointing toward the heavens, as if to remind those inside of the judgment of both man and God. A smell not of decay, exactly, but of iron beds, who scream at night, or stare at walls, or wander from place to place. They are sent on. Here where no carriages, you will find the institutions, low buildings with high walls, iron gates, stone arches, and barred windows too narrow to climb through. Structures designed not for welcome, perhaps, or rudimentary. Arithmetic, 15 to begin. Work, in service, or factories, or on farms. But for containment, it is here that the unwanted are kept. Not criminals. The workhouse was intended as a deterrent. So stripped of comfort, and only those most willing to suffer the loss of freedom, dignity, and privacy would remain. Begin with the workhouse. Men broken by grief, girls who cried too often, boys who spoke to themselves, were quietly gathered here, away from view, treated not with compassion but with regimen. Its very name speaks not of shelter or healing, but of labour. Created under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Women to another, children to a third. Not because of cruelty, they would say, but because of order. From the outside, it resembles a school or barracks, squat and symmetrical, a term so wide as to include anything from outspoken opinions to menstrual pain, and remain until her hair grayed, her speech faltered. But step through its doors. Families are separated, men to one wing, all are given uniforms, all are assigned numbers, all are expected to work. Work might mean breaking stones. There is no conversation across the sexes. There are no personal belongings beyond what one wears. There are no comforts, no books, no softness, only benches, narrow beds, and rows of tin bowls. Those who die here are buried quietly, cheaply, often in unmarked graves. Those who live carry the stigma with them forever, whose breath came shallow, whose bodies bore the toll of labour and soot and hunger and cold. Children, too, come to the workhouse, orphaned, abandoned, or simply too costly for their families to keep. They are not treated cruelly, perhaps, but neither are they loved. They are fed, clothed, taught basic skills, sewing, and those who do not thrive, who cannot work, who do not speak, to the asylums. Imagine a long corridor, high windows, bare floors, rows of iron beds, each with its own faint indentation where someone has lain for days. The Victorian asylum, those who could not conform to the rhythm of respectable society. Women with postnatal sadness, cold baths, locked doors, restraints. Not always physical, but environmental. No visitors, or few. In a room of your own making, take comfort not only in the softness of your pillow or the quiet around you, but in the knowledge that you are far from those corridors. No letters home, or only those screened by doctors. Many of those confined here were not violent. They were simply inconvenient. And yet, the asylum served a purpose. Not only medical, but moral. It reassured those outside that society was being managed. That sadness could be institutionalized. That deviation could be documented. That difference could be silenced. And between these walls, so many lives unfolded in repetitive quiet. A woman might be admitted at 24 hysteria. A boy might be sent for bedwetting. A man for mourning that lasted too long. And so they walked the gardens in circles and sat on benches, unmoving. And then there were the infirmaries. Places of sickness, of beds lined in rows, of nurses moving quietly between the dying. These were the wards for the old. It crept like a mist. The light was dim, and the dying? They did not cry out. They did not resist. They simply drifted, quietly, alone. Because in the institutions of Victorian England, suffering was not a cause for alarm. It was expected. It was ordinary, a fact of life, a weight to be borne with grace. And now, as you lie warm, but free, still we remember them, the silent, the unnamed, the unwanted, and in remembering, we honor them. Next, we'll rise from these institutions, back into the streets, but not into grandeur, into the underbelly, and the line between medicine and mortality was often very thin. The grave robbers, let us descend once more, not into the institutions of sickness or sorrow, but into a quieter, stranger corner of the Victorian world, one where science walked hand in hand with shadows, and where the human body, even in death, was not always allowed the dignity of rest. Its windows tall, but stained with soot and time. Its floors wooden, creaking softly beneath boots that have seen too much rain. In the center, long wooden tables, scrubbed but never quite clean, and around them, young men with waistcoats unbuttoned, sleeves rolled, faces pale not from fear but from the sharp tang of carbolic acid that hangs heavy in the air. We are entering a space that smells not of flowers or incense or even antiseptic, but of old wood and lamp oil, of chalk and linen, of something faintly sour, not quite decay, but the trace of it, the memory of it, clinging to walls and instruments and aprons soaked too many times. Many no older than 20, and they have come here to learn not from books alone. This is the world of the dissection hall. There is something else, something unspoken, for they all know the acquisition of human bodies for anatomical study was not a matter of simple donation or regulated supply, with shovels wrapped in cloth to muffle the scrape of iron on stone, and they worked quickly, in teams, with practiced efficiency, removing only the body, never disturbing the coffin too much, never taking clothes, though none said. Only the bodies of executed criminals could be used for dissection. And as the number of executions declined, while medical schools grew, the supply of legally sanctioned cadavers dwindled to a trickle. Imagine yourself now standing at the edge of a wide room with high ceilings, but often ignored, their arms laid open to reveal muscle and tendon like diagrams come to life. Others lie untouched, still beneath linen, waiting. They are medical students, eager, focused, children, Whoever had died recently and could be lifted before dawn. Fresh being a technical term here. On the tables, some are partially dissected, and while the students murmur Latin names and pass scalpels, because for much of the 19th century, especially before 1832, or installed iron cages, mort safes to prevent removal, it was a matter of theft, followed by quiet vigils, lest the dearly departed be stolen back before the earth had time to settle in the 1820s, but created their own supply by killing the vulnerable and selling their bodies to an anatomist named Knox, whose bodies filled the dissection halls. Not the criminal, but the invisible. You see, by law, and yet anatomy could not wait. Doctors needed to learn, but still resting on the same principle. Surgeons needed to practice. Students needed to see, to cut, to understand. And so, a new profession emerged. The resurrection men. They were not gravediggers in the traditional sense. They did not carve headstones or offer prayers. They came under cover of night, for stealing a corpse was not, under English law, technically, theft. There was no property in a dead body, only in the items, and so these men operated in legal greyness, watched, whispered about, sometimes caught and punished. Pieces catalogued for eternity in dusty corners of medical museums, because the doctors needed bodies, and the resurrectionists supplied them. It was said in hushed tones that some worked on commission, others simply delivered what they found. Graveyards were watched at night. Families poured concrete over coffins. Weeping relatives slept in graveyards in the first days after burial, and funerals became rushed affairs. And it was not just graves that fed the need. Stories, some true, some not told, of murder, not for passion or gain, but for dissection. The most infamous case, of course, was Burke and Hare, two men in Edinburgh, who, their crimes horrified the public, but the demand for bodies remained until finally, in 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed, allowing unclaimed bodies from workhouses, prisons, and asylums to be used for medical study, a legal solution, but a moral compromise. For now, it was the poor, the institutionalized, the forgotten, those who died without family, without burial funds, without identity. And so, long after the resurrection men had vanished into history, the practice continued. Quieter now, more regulated. That in death. As in life, some bodies were useful, others were protected. In the anatomy schools, studied, sketched, dissected, and then quietly removed. Some buried in massed graves, some kept as specimens, bones in drawers, organs in jars, and all the while medicine advanced. Diseases were understood, organs mapped, but always on the backs of the voiceless. And so now, as your eyes grow heavy, as you feel the softness of your bed and the certainty of your safety, let your breath settle. You are far from the chill of the dissection hall, far from the lantern-lit graveyard, far from the long table and its silent teacher, but behind every successful surgery, every chart, every textbook, a name we do not know, a body that was not claimed, a sacrifice that was never offered, only taken. We will leave the city soon, but before we go, There is one more secret to uncover, one more shadow to walk through, the darkest of all. The crimes committed in parlors, behind drawn curtains, in the name of secrecy, shame, and control. Let us now gently, and without alarm, secrets of reproductive life in the Victorian age. Let us step now, quietly, and without judgment, into one of the most secretive and tightly controlled parts of Victorian life. Not the streets, not the parlor, not the asylum or the anatomy hall, but the unseen world of a woman's body, a world bound tightly in silence, in shame, in euphemism, where menstruation was barely spoken of, where contraception was taboo, and where, beneath the lace and propriety, many women carried silent burdens of unwanted pregnancies, of difficult births, of chronic miscarriages, or be taken from them at any time, and in the unrelenting pressure to appear both fertile and modest, maternal and untouched, perhaps still barely past girlhood, standing before her dressing mirror in a softly lit room, brushing her hair with practiced strokes, her corset already cinched, her chemise tucked neatly under lace, her features calm, her expression composed, announced only by missed cycles and the gentle swelling of the belly, a change in appetite, but by midwives or neighbors. With the doors closed, the curtains drawn, and the pain endured in silence, without anesthesia, without the comfort of knowledge, with only whispers and prayers, to carry the mother through, a hint of nausea, and even then not to be confirmed aloud, only hinted at, wrapped in the language of expecting, or in a delicate condition, that she will bear children regularly, unless a wet nurse is hired. And all of this without ever discussing the acts that lead to pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth, or the pain that may follow, natural and ignorant. In this world, a woman's value was closely tied to reproduction, but of power and permission, to produce heirs, to raise the next generation. And yet, the very mechanisms of that process were treated as unmentionable, too improper for public conversation, their strength worn thin by the constant demand of fertility, and too closely policed to allow women full autonomy over their own bodies. The result was a culture thick with contradictions, where motherhood was glorified, but childbirth was hidden. Imagine now a young woman, perhaps newly married. She has no formal education in biology. Books sold under counters with titles like Fruits of Philosophy or Married Love, offering advice couched in delicate language, withdrawal, barrier methods, abstinence. But even possessing such literature could lead to scandal, legal trouble, even imprisonment, which promised to restore regularity, a euphemism for inducing menstruation, whether delayed by stress or by early pregnancy. She has no access to modern reproductive knowledge. She cannot speak freely about what she feels in her abdomen, her chest, her mind, for such topics are considered improper, their cause of death listed as fever or uterine inflammation, of failing to protect one's purity. And yet, she is expected to produce children, but expected to manage. It is assumed that she will conceive quickly, rarely asking the women themselves what they felt or feared or wanted. For many women, pregnancy was a mystery, something that arrived silently, and when birth came, it was often in the home, attended not by doctors. Some survived, some did not. For even in the best of homes, childbirth was dangerous. Infections were common, bleeding could be fatal, and for those who bore child after child, it was a life shaped by cycles, not only of blood and birth, because the ability to prevent pregnancy, to say not now or not again, was not in a woman's hands. Contraception, though not entirely unknown, was fraught with stigma and shame. There were pamphlets circulated quietly among women who whispered to one another over laundry tubs, among midwives who passed down advice in coded language, among prostitutes, and, when contraception failed, because abortion, in alley clinics, in private homes, some turned to pills. Others visited angel makers, often without medical training, with tools unsterilized. Some became sick, some died quietly, and always the shame remained. The burden of having fallen. Society offered no sanctuary for these women. A widow with 5 children was pitied. A servant girl with a rounded belly was dismissed. A wife who did not bear children was considered incomplete. A woman who bore too many was blamed for her frailty. And all the while, doctors, almost entirely male, debated her condition in journals. In universities, in medical clubs, their theories ranged from the absurd to the cruel, that a woman's womb wandered, that her nerves were too delicate for learning, that too much reading could render her infertile, that passion was dangerous, that a woman's highest calling was to be a vessel. And yet, women endured. They formed networks of quiet support. They shared recipes, advice, names whispered only when the doors were locked. They cared for each other. They raised children they did not choose to have. They buried children they could not save. Their resilience was quiet, their strength invisible, their choices limited, but still they persisted, bearing not only life, but the silence that came with it. So now, as you lie in your room, free to speak, to learn, to choose, let your breath slow. There is nothing to fear in this knowledge, only remembrance. We will soon leave the city behind, step away from the fog and the filth, the graveyards and parlors, and we will look gently at the strange professions, the oddest jobs that held the empire together, jobs you would not expect, lives lived at the edge of what was known. Let us go there now, to the bizarre world of chimney sweeps, leech collectors, and mourning dressers. The most bizarre jobs of Victorian society. Imagine, now, waking not in your own bed, but in a narrow cot tucked into a room above a stable, or beneath a stairwell, or perhaps in a corner of an attic, where the eaves slope so low you must stoop as you rise. Your boots are beside the bed, cracked leather, scuffed. Your shirt smells faintly of smoke, and your day will not begin with a newspaper or a warm breakfast. Dancing on rooftops, the truth, as it often is in history, or a leech, or a corpse. Welcome to the world of the forgotten professions. Jobs that filled the gaps in society's machinery, precisely because his body was small enough to fit inside. The narrow flues that twisted up through Victorian townhouses and drew the smoke from 1,000 grates. Himself. The child would be sent up inside a cold chimney, armed only with brushes and a burlap sack, sometimes even without tools at all, using elbows and knees to scrape away the soot. His face blackened, his lungs slowly darkening with every breath. Roles without glamour. Let us begin with one of the smallest and saddest workers of all. Though the image has become romanticized, the cheerful sweep with his brush and cap. In many cases, the sweep was not a grown man, but a boy, a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, thin, where the water grows still and warm and thick with algae, standing ankle-deep in murky water, her hands moving carefully beneath the surface, not for fishing, but for medicine, led by his master, usually a sweep, who had once been a climbing boy, in the idea that imbalance in the body could be corrected by releasing blood, and leeches. Slippery, it was dark inside. Tight, places them gently into jars filled with water. Children became stuck. They suffocated. They fell. Or they emerged, coughing, blistered, burned, for some chimneys were still warm from the night's fire. And not every homeowner remembered to wait. And yet, for many families, this work was the only income they had, the only path off the street, and so the boys climbed, used in industry, or even in cosmetics, a strange circle of cleanliness, dressed in black from hat to boot, arms for swelling. Now, walk with me away from the soot and into the woods, to the edges of ponds and rivers, perhaps too shaken or too refined. Here you may find a woman. She is a leech collector. Her job is to gather leeches, not for food, for Victorian physicians still believed in the ancient art of blood. And so the woman stands. She waits until they swell with her blood, and then she removes them, looking for anything of value in the thick, sticky sludge, and dangerous in its own quiet way. Too many bites. Some women collapsed in the water. Hospitals ordered thousands. Doctors kept them in bowls on their desks. There were even specialists who knew which part of the body should be leeched. Temples for fever, a quiet, methodical profession, drawn from the swamp, paid in pennies, but vital to the Victorian medical imagination. And what of the mutes? They were not silent by nature, but silent by occupation, employed by undertakers. They did not smile, never silver. They simply stood at the foot of the coffin, by the doorway, beside the mourning family. Their presence was meant to signify grief, dignified and restrained, of how the outward signs of mourning were used, not only to honor the dead, but to protect the living, that this was a life worth honoring, that this was pain too great for words. Sometimes they were hired for an hour, sometimes for the procession, sometimes only for appearances of stillness. Then there were the children, mostly boys, some girls, who scoured the banks of the Thames when the tide receded. Bones, nails, rags, coal, into photography studios where the dead posed among the living, into cemeteries landscaped like parks, and into the pages of mourning manuals that taught one how to cry with dignity. They sold what they could, a piece of iron, a little more. It was dangerous work. The mud was deep, and sometimes pulled children under. The water was toxic, the tides unpredictable, and yet the mudlark was part of the city's life. A scavenger, a survivor, a child. No one noticed until he failed to return home. And finally, let us not forget the morning dresser, in a world obsessed with rules. And when death arrived, it was the morning dresser's job to transform the grieving, especially widows, into figures of correct sorrow. She helped her clients into black crepe and bombazine. She selected veils of the appropriate length. She advised on jewelry, of etiquette. And though her work was not emotional, she did not weep. It required a kind of intimate understanding of pain, of presence. All of these professions, strange, forgotten, quiet, lived in the margins of Victorian life. They were not written about in novels. They were not celebrated in paintings, but they were real, and they made the city. So now, as you rest, think of them, not with pity, but with quiet recognition. The child in the chimney, the woman in the pond, the man in the veil, the girl in the mud. Each one lived a life in shadow, but each one held up a part of that great, creaking, elegant machine called the Victorian world. And next, we'll explore the obsession with mourning itself, with death, with rituals, with the culture of sorrow that turned grief into an art form. We'll step into parlors. The art of grief in a world obsessed with death. Imagine now, for a moment, that you are entering a room where time has paused. The light dim, the windows drawn, the ticking of the clock slowed by sorrow, and every object softened, muted, marked by absence. The air is heavy, the breathless stillness of a space where death has only just passed through, but with reverence. A public expression of private and the slow unraveling of memory into respectability. In Victorian England, grief was not private, it was not silent. A widow entered what was called deep mourning, a period that might last 1 year or more, during which she wore only black, not just any black, but specific fabrics, matte, crepe, bombazine, materials that did not shine, that absorbed light. Curtains were drawn and kept closed. Clocks were stopped at the hour of death, sometimes left motionless for days, layered and expected. Mirrors were draped in black crepe or turned to the wall, not only to prevent vanity, but to avoid the ancient superstition that a soul might become trapped in its reflection, during which she was permitted to wear muted colors, lavender, grey, mauve, colors that whispered of returning light, a dark suit, a somber tie, and the social limitations less strict, of sorrow fading, slowly, arranged in delicate patterns, framed in brooches, rings, or even displayed in glass domes on the mantelpiece. It was not improvised, bore a small band of black cloth. Servants moved with deliberate. Even the sound of cutlery at meals was subdued. Meals themselves, simpler, plainer, less adorned. It was ritual, and posed the body in a crib, or seated in a chair, the eyes closed, the skin pale, the surroundings carefully curated to appear peaceful, even dreamlike. To mourn was to perform, not insincerely. Let us begin with the home, tucked into prayer books. But at the time, it was a gesture of love. Still rare, it was not uncommon for the first and only photograph taken of a person to be one taken after death. They built new, vast, landscaped garden cemeteries, Highgate, Kensal Green, Brompton. Places where death was not hidden. Upon the death of a family member, a husband, a child, a parent, the house itself was transformed. The front door, if the family was respectable. And then there was the mourning attire. Hourglasses, weeping willows, clasped hands, broken columns, particularly for women. Her veil, known as a weeping veil, was long, often trailing down her back and across her face. Jewellery was sparse, if allowed at all. Black jet, carved into cameos or lock, often containing a strand of the deceased's hair. Carefully arranged under glass. No lace, no satin, shoes, gloves, parasols, all black. Her life, too, was constricted. She wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years, and the country followed her lead. Mourning became fashion. Fashion became mourning. She could not attend social events. She was discouraged from laughter, from music, from dancing. Letters she wrote were edged in black ink. Even the stamps on her correspondence bore a dark border. After deep mourning came half mourning, though the expectations were shorter. A black armband, but it was women who bore the visible, extended burden of grief and beyond dress. There were mourning objects, hairwork, jewellery, from cholera, from accidents, from hunger. Grief was not a rare event. It was constant, like weather, like fog. Death announcements, bordered in black, mailed promptly to friends and family. Memorial cards, which brings us to a strange and haunting practice. Post-mortem photography. At a time when photography was still new, still expensive, if only for an hour, safe, far from the ticking clocks and black veils, breathe slowly. A mother might dress her child in white, arrange flowers around the still figure. In some cases, eyes were painted onto closed eyelids. Stands and braces were used to pose the dead upright. Families posed beside them. These photographs were treasured, a way of capturing what would otherwise fade completely. And then, the Victorians transformed burial into spectacle. No longer content with overcrowded churchyards. Angels wept in stone. Wrought iron gates surrounded family plots. Tombs bore poetry, scripture, Latin, epitaphs, and symbols. Urns, families picnicked beside graves. Lovers walked among them. And every year, flowers were brought, anniversaries observed. It was death made public, respectable. Even Queen Victoria herself became the icon of mourning. After Prince Albert died in 1861, the cards and customs, a child. The grief was real. The rituals were a way to make it visible, a way to structure pain, to survive it, because when so many died from childbirth, and so the Victorians, in all their rigid formality, gave it shape. They wrapped it in rules. They folded it into habits, and in doing so, now, as you lie in your quiet room, remember that grief, even today, needs time, needs softness, and sometimes needs silence. We will leave death behind, gently, and next, we will return to life, to leisure, to the oddities of recreation, sideshows, and the peculiar ways people tried to escape the darkness, haunted amusements, sideshows, and the search for wonder. Let your mind drift now, away from the solemn hush of morning rooms and the cold stillness of graveyards, and tonight it is prepared for something altogether different, and instead toward a soft red glow, cozy and crowded, velvet curtains drawn, a faint scent of sandalwood or rosewater drifting in the air, the tick of a mantel clock muffled beneath layers of rug and wallpaper. The Victorians carried in their hearts an aching curiosity, a hunger for mystery, for proof of something beyond death, for one last conversation with a lost mother, a missing child, a beloved friend, taken too soon. This is not a church, nor a theatre, but a drawing room spreading across England from America, where the Fox sisters claimed to receive messages through knocking sounds, raps from the beyond. Not a recital, because even in a society obsessed with rules and restraint, and so they turned to the spirit. Spiritualism, eyes fluttering, voice changing. The Victorians, ever formal, turned this belief into ritual. Tables were arranged in circles, candles were lit, hands were joined, and mediums. Often women would enter trances. Sometimes the table would rise. Sometimes a bell would ring on its own. Sometimes a chalkboard would reveal a ghostly scribble, and those present would lean in, not in fear. Some were skeptics. Some believed fervently, lit inside with strings of flickering bulbs. And see, the sign painted in curling red letters, marvels of the human form. Wonders from around the globe, most, perhaps, simply needed to believe. Blue cold air through tubes, cracked joints for ghostly sounds, where human difference, in size, in shape, in condition, became performant, to feel, even for a moment, that their grief had not ended in silence, that their love could still echo back from the dark. But not all were sincere. Some mediums were clever. They faked ectoplasm with cheesecloth or egg whites. They palmed bells. And yet, few were angry when the trick was revealed. For wasn't the illusion? It was not only the dead who filled Victorian leisure. There was also the strange. Step with me now into a tent. Canvas flapping gently in the evening breeze. You have entered the freak show. A spectacle at once, mesmerizing and unsettling. There, on a small platform, stands the bearded lady. Her voice clear and steady, her gaze direct. Beside her, the man known as the living skeleton, limbs thin as twigs, smiling faintly as he tips his hat. The conjoined twins, sewn into the same dress, speak in unison. The giant in polished boots. The tattooed man flexes in silence. Some were born with conditions they turned into careers. Some were dressed up, stories invented, identities changed to add mystery. The little person from Wapping becomes a prince from the Orient. The tall man becomes a Russian soldier. It was theatre, floating spectres dancing across glass. The precursor to cinema, 2 holograms, 2 magic lanterns, the painted rooms with moving light. But for many performers, it was also agency, a way to earn money, travel, gain recognition, even marry. And the audience, wide-eyed and whispering, were they curious? Yes. Cruel, sometimes, but mostly fascinated, because in a world where everything was ordered, symmetrical, measured, here was something unpredictable. A human experience outside of expectation, and yet entirely real. In the city's pleasure gardens and mechanical halls, other amusements awaited. Automata mechanical dolls, intricately made, that played violins, nodded their heads, or wrote names in perfect script. Children watched them in silence. Adults marveled at their precision. Were they alive? No, but they moved like they might be. And in the gaslit corners of toy shops, Pepper's ghost illusions made apparitions appear in mirrors. And then there were the fads. Mesmerism, early hypnosis, phrenology redoing the bumps on one's head to determine personality, electric belts, for vitality, seaweed tonics, for strength, laughter, therapy, dietary reform, each promised transformation, each tinged with mystery, each a glimpse into the hunger that lived beneath the corseted calm, a hunger for control, for meaning, for something more than smoke and sorrow, because for all their mourning, and so they filled their lives with it. In parlors, now, as your eyes grow heavier and the world softens into shadow, think gently of those quiet joys, of a woman laughing behind her veil at a mechanical bird, of a boy holding his father's hand, of a crowd clapping for the living marvels of the human body, and let sleep come softly as the final gaslight dims and the curtain falls on our third act. To the colonies, the factories, the far edges of the world where the sun never set, and the shadow stretched wide, the empire in shadow. The wind is warm here, the air hums with insects and strange bird song. And though you are far from London, from the clatter of cabs and the black crepe of morning, exotic spices in the kitchen, cotton shirts, and carved ivory combs, you are still, unmistakably, in the presence of Victorian power. You are in the Empire. For while Victorian life at home was filled with its own peculiarities and sorrows, it cannot be fully understood without the knowledge that beyond its island borders, English-style gardens growing in arid soil, Indian soldiers, Indian nannies, ayahs, carry white children on their hips, speak to them in 2 languages, raise them only to be sent away. Once the family returns to England, and imported customs that did not quite fit the climate or the people, cramped huts for the labourers. Britain had extended its reach across continents. India, Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, Australia. A web of colonies tied together, not only by trade and governance, where British interests, often framed as civilizing missions, extended into territories carved up during the so-called scramble for Africa, resources taken and shipped across oceans. British officials lived in compounds, administered new laws, taxed native populations, and introduced Western systems of measurement, religion, and order. But by the heavy weight of ideology, to be Victorian at home, but to be Victorian in the colonies, or to be colonized, was to live in a very different rhythm. Her dress heavy despite the heat, her skin powdered to keep sweat at bay. She writes a letter home about the servants. She does not mention the hunger outside her walls, the laws that govern the people in a language not their own, or the ways in which local traditions are being reshaped. Let us begin with India. The sockled jewel in the crown, the British presence there, by the mid-19th century, was well established, both through the East India Company and, later, direct rule under the Crown. To understand that the empire was not only a place, but a condition, mistreatment, cultural imposition, but on the surface, the colonial world often tried to mirror the motherland. Sugar plantations continued to operate, profits flowed back to London, and those who worked the fields, owners sipping rum on English verandas. Imagine an English officer's wife, sitting beneath a lazily turning fan, or might not want to know, and who went hungry that he might be clothed, that the leaves were picked by hands that bled in silence. Nearby, there are clubs for Europeans only. There are schools, some British run, some local, some forbidden. There are homes, large compounds for the officials, and behind every cup of tea, every cotton garment, every polished mahogany chair is the work of thousands. The same is true in Africa. Here, labor was forced or coerced, and yet most Victorians in Britain knew little of these details. They knew the empire. Map rooms in schools showed the globe dyed in pink. Exhibitions in London displayed artifacts, sometimes even people from distant lands. Articles in newspapers spoke of explorers, and the darker stories of rebellion, disease, punishment were softened, censored, or ignored. Even in Australia, a settler colony, the Victorian legacy is built on the erasure of Aboriginal lives and land. Convicts were sent across the sea, but also children, officials who renamed rivers and hills, and behind each act of establishment was a loss of language. And then there were the Caribbean colonies, where, though slavery had been abolished officially in 1833, its echoes lingered for decades, in the form of indentured servitude, economic control, and social stratification. It is important now, as you lie quietly, of narrative control, of presenting one version of reality at home. It was maintained through language, by calling resource, extraction trade, by calling occupation protection. It was maintained through distance, so that the woman in Brighton sipping her morning tea might not know, so that the man in Manchester wearing a cotton vest. And yet, the empire was not silent. There were voices, resisting, writing, protesting. In India, poets and philosophers questioned British rule. In Jamaica, in South Africa, in Burma, in Nigeria. Resistance lived in rhythm, in story, in refusal. But it was not the Victorian way to speak of such things over supper. So the stories were buried, and instead, the empire lived on in souvenirs, in family crests and botanical drawings, in photographs of young officers standing beside pyramids, in museums filled with items that once belonged to others. Now, as the night deepens and your eyes begin to close, remember this. The Victorian world was not only gas lamps and corsets, soot and sorrow. It was also reach. It was present. It was a shadow, stretching wide in silence. And next, we'll look closely at how this empire touched home. In the factories, in the work of children, in the women stitching lace, and the men sweating in iron foundries, because the wealth of empire didn't just come from abroad. It came from the labor of millions, right there in the heart of England. Factories, child labor, and the price of progress. Let the darkness around you now soften, and imagine, far off in the distance, the low hum of industry, not the rhythmic hush of a train or the soft footfall of evening, but a deeper sound, a kind of growl, constant and low, a mechanical thrum that never quite ceases. This is the sound of industry, the pulse of the mill, the very foundation of Victorian power. Here, progress was not just an idea. It was a smell, a texture, a weight in the lungs. It smelled of smoke, of oil, of iron that had been hammered and reheated until it glowed. It felt like calloused fingers, cotton dust in the throat, grit beneath the nails. And it moved, always moved, with the relentless rhythm of the machine. This was the Industrial Revolution in full bloom, and it was not tidy. Let us walk together, slowly, past the rows of brick-built textile mills, rising like fortresses against grey skies, tall chimneys pouring smoke, or to gather scraps, or to crawl into tight spaces to fix a jam, guided only by candlelight and memory. Carding frames, iron beasts with 1,000 tiny teeth, belts spinning overhead, their motion so constant, so familiar, it becomes almost hypnotic. Windows stained with years of dust. Step inside one. The floorboards tremble beneath your feet. The air is thick. The machines are huge. Looms, spinning jennies, and working among them are children, some no older than 8, then loosen, then fall. Some smaller, they are barefoot. They move quickly, not lazily or dreamily, but with the sharp efficiency that fear teaches. Their task might be to clean the underside of a loom, sometimes the sons and daughters of desperate families, and marched into factories where the sound was too loud to speak, the air too dry to breathe, the hours far too long. Why, children? Because their hands were small, opening and closing ventilation doors to regulate airflow deep underground. They sat in the dark for hours, alone, listening for the rumble of carts, or the sound of shouting men. If they fell asleep, they were beaten, because they could be paid less. Their fingers becoming stiff with slurry, their lungs absorbing powdered glaze laced with lead. They were called paintresses and dippers, harnessed like animals. They worked for hours in cramped sheds, often without masks or gloves. Their fingers bled from the needles. Their backs ached. And yet the work continued, because the alternative was hunger, because the law had not yet decided to protect them, and so, long before the morning sun, they were roused from crowded beds, sometimes orphans. 13-hour shifts were not uncommon. Molten metal poured into molds with a hiss that never stopped. The air shimmered with it. If a child lost a finger, if they dozed, they were whipped. If they wept, imagine now the match girls. They worked not with iron or cotton, but with phosphorus, dipping wooden sticks into white phosphorus to make matches. Their hands were stained yellow, and after months of exposure, their teeth began to ache. A condition called phossy jaw, a kind of chemical necrosis that rotted the jawbone from within. They were teenage girls, most of them. They laughed, they sang as they worked. But when the pain came, it came slowly, and it rarely left. And still, the matches were made, sold for pennies, used in parlors across England. In the potteries of Stoke-on-Trent, girls pressed clay into moulds all day in the coal mines. Boys as young as 5 worked as trappers. Deeper in, other boys. Sometimes they walked, bent double. Above ground, in the iron foundries, men worked in unbearable heat. And in the sweatshops, mass-produced clothing sold in stalls and markets. Progress, as it was called, had a price, and that price was paid by the body. Yet, there was pride, too, in work. A girl who could operate 3 looms was respected. A boy who hauled coal faster than others was praised. A woman who stitched faster than the rest might feed her children, and communities grew from this labor. Pub songs, friendly societies, trade unions. There were reformers, Sunday schools and charities. But for many, change came slowly, or not at all. And so the children continued to rise. The women continued to walk home in silence, aching. The men returned to their tenements, hands blackened, faces hollow. And yet, the world celebrated the progress. New railways, more coal, greater exports, longer ledgers. No one wrote songs about the trappers. No statues for the dippers. No portraits of the match girl whose jaw ached in the night. Now, as your own breath deepens and your limbs grow still, let your thoughts soften. You are not in the mill. You are not on the floor. You are not crawling beneath the loom. You are safe. You are warm. And next, we'll turn toward the margins again. To the criminals, the pickpockets, the so-called dangerous classes. To the alleys where shadows deepened. To the ones who lived outside the law, not always by choice. The Victorian underworld awaits. In the gutters glow, past the factories and furnaces, away from the stiff collars and ticking clocks of respectability. The air cooler. The stones beneath your feet are uneven, sometimes slick with recent rain or waste tossed from a window above. The smell is sharper, not perfumed, but earthy, human, lived in. The street here is narrower. This is not a place shown in postcards, but now, older, wiser, knowing which dockworkers might look the other way, which collectors paid in full. This is London's East End, or Manchester's back streets, or a Liverpool dock alley, and it is full. People who lived outside the edge of safety, who scraped by with hands always moving, pushing a wooden cart filled with apples. His call, rhythmic and practiced, blended with the clamour of hoofbeats and hawkers, creating a song of commerce, made not with silver, but with grit. His fingers were swift. Often, occasionally, here lived the costermonger, the mudlark, whom we met before, dug still through riverbanks, and in the shadows moved others, less visible, children with quick hands, women with watchful eyes, men who drank more than they ate. Among them, the pickpocket, known sometimes as a dipper. He worked in crowds, in church processions, at markets, on bustling omnibus steps, moving silently, brushing past with precision. Many were trained by necessity, by family, by older boys who watched for talent and took a cut. And if they were caught, a shout, the constable's grip on the collar, and a courtroom, harsh, indifferent, echoing with the sound of sentence. 3 months, hard labor, 7 years, transportation. Transportation to Vanderman's land, to exile. Even when the crime was small, the punishment could be vast. But crime, for many, was less a choice than a rhythm, the natural pulse of a life with few doors left unlocked. Take the prostitute. She might be 14 or 30. She might work in a brothel, or alone, in an alley, or a hatpin to protect herself. Not all were destitute, but most had few choices. When wages for a seamstress would barely buy bread, and a client might offer 10 times that in one evening, the streets were their place of business, and also their danger. They were watched by police, by reformers, by predators. Some found protection in numbers, others vanished into the fog. In the shadows, too, were the resurrection men, body snatchers who dug up fresh graves, not for mischief, but for science. They sold corpses to medical schools, quietly, illegally. It was not a respected trade, and always, hovering nearby, were the poor. Not criminal, not idle, simply exhausted. They lived in workhouses or in tenements, where 8 people shared a single damp room. But simply for being homeless, for loitering, they burned furniture to stay warm. They lost children to fever, to damp, to accident. Charles Dickens described them. Henry Mayhew interviewed them. But most people never saw them at all. Out of sight, out of mind. Even the charities, well-meaning though they often were, could not reach all. There were soup kitchens, night shelters, Salvation Army prayers. But for every plate of food, and there were laws, like the Vagrancy Act. The poor were criminalized not for what they did. Still, there was a culture here, deep and defiant. Songs sung in the alleys, nicknames whispered between friends, slang that painted life in color, coppers for coins, rattling coves for police, dip for a pickpocket. There were penny dreadfuls read by candlelight, cheap books that told wild tales of highwaymen and ghosts, and music halls where for a ha'penny you could laugh, forget, and remember what it was to feel like someone. In all this, amid the hunger and soot, still the rhythm of lives lived just outside the lamplight. As you lie still now, far from the alley's chill, let this part of history settle gently in your thoughts. Not to disturb, but to understand. The Victorian world was not just lace and letters. It was also the child with no shoes, the woman with a bruise, the man too proud to beg, and all of them were part of the same story. Next, we'll come to the final part of our journey, not in factories, nor graves, nor side streets, but in the mind, to the asylums, to the theories of madness, to the quiet corridors where people were kept, and sometimes forgotten. Madness, asylums, and the silent struggle of the mind. Now, let us drift once more Imagine yourself approaching a building on the edge of the countryside. Large, symmetrical, imposing. Perhaps there are high walls. Perhaps tall chimneys rising from its slate-tiled roof. The air smells faintly of chalk and medicine. The grounds are manicured, yet strangely still, and above the arched doorway, you may find the words lunatic, asylum, or more delicately, retreat for the mentally afflicted. This is where the Victorians placed those whose minds, they believed, had become unwell. Let us enter. There is no need to fear, only to observe gently, calmly, as though passing through a forgotten dream. The asylum, for many Victorians, was a place of mystery. For others, it was a solution, sometimes welcomed, sometimes forced. In a society where order, self-restraint, too much grief, erratic behavior, and so thousands were confined, or melancholy following the loss of employment, others merely poor, misunderstood. The reasons were often startlingly vague. A woman might be committed for hysteria, overexcitement, refusing to speak, or reading too many novels. A man might be admitted for religious delusion. Children, too, found themselves behind these walls, some with conditions we now recognize as neurological. And then there were the elderly, the disabled, the lonely, and for whom the asylum became those who had nowhere else to go, inside. Those who had nowhere else to go, inside. Life, 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 life. Life, life, disease. I love you because I know no other way than this. The life of or like we all know. Wake, wash, breakfast, then chores, laundry, sweeping, tending the grounds, allowed fresh air. In these places, staff were trained to observe, not punish. Birds were kept. Patients were encouraged to engage gently with the world around them. Then meals, inspection, silence. Some asylums believed in the moral treatment model, where patients were treated with kindness, as the Victorians understood it, was not a single thing, but a wide and complex landscape. In overcrowded, underfunded asylums, treatment was often custodial, restraints were common. Silence was enforced, misbehavior punished. There was hydrotherapy. There were rotating chairs designed to disorient. A place where they no longer had to pretend to be normal. There was electrical stimulation. Records from the time are filled with clinical, measured phrases. Patient refuses to eat. Patient walks in circles. Patient stared at window for 3 hours without blinking. People whose lives had shifted just slightly away from the acceptable. A widow who could not stop weeping. A soldier who heard echoes of the battlefield in his dreams. A child who spoke to the air and smiled at things no one else could see. A poet who could not bear crowds. A seamstress who began to sing at midnight and would not stop. Their stories, so rarely told in full, remind us that madness, one marked by misunderstanding, by fear, but sometimes also by care, There were doctors who tried, patients who improved and were released, and others who found in the asylum a strange kind of peace. And yet, many were forgotten, buried not only in unmarked graves, but in census rolls. They became entries. Let your thoughts soften now. These were not villains or curiosities. They were neighbors, brothers, the ones who slipped through the cracks in a world that prized surface perfection. Their stories are quieter than others, but still worth hearing. And as you rest, think not of the locked doors or the stark wards, but of a small window and someone gazing through it, watching the trees sway, remembering a song, feeling, perhaps for the first time in weeks. And so we come gently to the end of this segment. We've wandered through so much: empire, labor, poverty, silence, sorrow. And next, we will step into our final chapter, one not of darkness, but reflection, a slow return to the present, to what remains and what we've forgotten, to how the past lingers in corners of our world still. So close your eyes and prepare to drift toward the end. And now we return, slowly, quietly, leaving the rooms one by one, the hush of rituals too old to remember. You've felt the weight of fabric, heavy crepe and worn cotton, stranger weight of empire, carried sometimes without knowing, but always present, not across miles, but across time, through foggy streets and firelit parlors, and into the silent spaces between what history records and what it forgets. You've met the unseen hands, the mudlarks and matchgirls, the mourning mothers and chimney sweeps, the clerks in starched collars, but as a murmur of lives overlapping, the patients who sat for hours in thought, unheard. You've heard the rhythms of work, the language of sorrow, and maybe, just maybe, you've come to understand the Victorian world, not as a single narrative. You see, for every column written in a ledger, there was a child coughing in a mill. For every tea served in fine china, there was a servant smoothing the cloth with aching hands. For every photograph of a widow in black, there were memories too painful to capture, the gas lamps unlit. And for every whisper of madness behind closed doors, there was a story of someone trying to hold on. It was a time of contradictions, of formality and fear, and though it is long past now, in the systems we rarely question. We walk on streets they built, we read books they wrote, we drink tea they once brought across oceans. And sometimes, without even knowing, who hoped and struggled just as we do. But tonight, you can let all of that fade. The morning veil has been folded and put away. The window is open, and only the breeze moves through. You are here, in this soft moment, with breath slow and steady, with eyes that may now be gently closed, and the past, it waits, not to haunt, but to teach, to soothe, to remind us that every age, let history hold you, and tomorrow, when you wake, the world will still be here, but tonight, you are safe, you are still, and you are far from the gaslit shadows, back in your own quiet time. And thank you for listening.